For months, California's business landscape has been shifting quietly. Major companies have reduced operations, relocated headquarters, or exited the state altogether, often with little public explanation. What has been noticeably absent in many of these moments is an immediate, direct response from state leadership. That silence has fueled uncertainty among workers, investors, and local governments trying to understand what these departures really mean. Now, with another high-profile company leaving the state, the governor has finally responded. The timing of that response matters. Corporate exits are not just symbolic decisions, they affect jobs, tax revenue, commercial real estate, and long-term economic confidence. When companies leave, the consequences are felt unevenly, often hitting employees and regional economies first, long before policy adjustments are debated. This moment is less about one company and more about a pattern that has been building over several years. Business departures rarely happen overnight. They are the result of accumulated pressures, strategic recalculations, and changing risk assessments. A public response from state leadership marks a recognition that these decisions are no longer isolated. This breakdown examines what prompted the governor's response, what was said and what was not, and why this moment could signal a shift in how California addresses business exits going forward. The focus is on impact, accountability, and what comes next if the underlying pressures remain unresolved. 10. Company departure highlights long-standing economic tensions. When a major company leaves California, the decision rarely comes as a sudden surprise inside boardrooms. These exits are typically the final step in a long process shaped by rising costs, regulatory complexity, and shifting risk calculations. What makes each departure significant is not the single event itself, but how clearly it exposes tensions that have been building beneath the surface. California remains one of the world's largest and most dynamic economies, but it also operates with higher baseline costs than most states. Businesses face layered regulatory requirements, expensive real estate, complex labor rules, and volatile tax exposure. For many firms, these pressures are manageable for years, until they are not. At that point, relocation becomes a strategic option rather than a threat. This particular company's exit brought those tensions back into public view. It highlighted how decisions made quietly over time can culminate in a visible departure that feels abrupt to workers and communities left behind. While the company may cite flexibility, restructuring, or market alignment, the underlying factors often reflect broader economic conditions rather than isolated preferences. This issue matters because it sets the context for everything that follows. One departure does not define a trend, but repeated exits reveal a pattern. Each case reinforces concerns among employees, local governments, and other businesses watching closely. At this stage, the impact is more symbolic than systemic. However, symbols matter. They shape perception, confidence, and expectations. As attention shifts from the company to the consequences, the pressure quickly moves to those most immediately affected, workers and communities facing uncertainty long before any policy response takes form. 9. Workers and local communities absorb the immediate impact. When a company leaves the state, the first consequences are rarely felt in boardrooms or government offices. They are felt by workers and the local communities that depend on those jobs. Even when companies promise gradual transitions or partial retention of staff, uncertainty sets in immediately. Employees begin questioning job security, relocation options, and long-term stability. For workers, the impact is often uneven. Some roles may be retained remotely, while others tied to physical locations face elimination or forced relocation. Support staff, contractors, and service providers are frequently the most vulnerable. These positions are less likely to be preserved and more difficult to replace quickly. As a result, income instability spreads beyond the company itself. Local communities feel the effects through reduced spending and economic activity. Businesses near corporate campuses, restaurants, retail shops, service providers experience declines as workers cut back or leave the area. Housing markets may soften as demand shifts, affecting property values and rental stability. Municipal governments face pressure as sales and payroll tax revenues weaken. This issue matters because these impacts occur before any formal policy response. While state leadership may still be assessing the situation, workers and communities are already adjusting to new realities. The lag between corporate decisions and public action creates a gap where uncertainty grows. At this stage, the damage is localized, but it sets the tone for broader concern. As stories of displacement and disruption spread, attention turns outward, toward commercial real estate markets that often reflect economic shifts earlier than official data. 8. Commercial real estate feels the first shockwaves. One of the earliest measurable impacts of a company leaving the state appears in commercial real estate. Office buildings, campuses, and industrial properties are long-term assets designed around stable occupancy. When a major tenant exits or downsizes, the effects ripple quickly through local real estate markets. Vacancy rates often rise before new tenants can be secured. Large corporate spaces are not easily repurposed, especially in regions where demand has already softened. Property owners face declining lease revenue while still carrying maintenance costs, taxes, and debt obligations. In some cases, buildings are placed on the market at steep discounts, resetting valuations across entire districts. These changes affect more than landlords. Falling property values reduce local tax assessments, putting pressure on city budgets that rely on commercial property taxes to fund services. Construction projects tied to future office demand may be delayed or canceled, affecting employment in related sectors. For surrounding neighborhoods, the impact is visible. Foot traffic declines. Retail vacancies increase. Areas once anchored by steady corporate presence can shift rapidly, altering the character and economic stability of the community. Recovery is often slow, especially if multiple companies exit within a short period. This issue matters because commercial real estate acts as an early warning system. It reflects changes in business confidence and employment patterns before they show up in broader economic indicators. As vacancies rise and values fall, the narrative shifts from a single company's decision to a wider concern about regional economic health, intensifying pressure on state leadership to respond publicly. 7. State leadership faces growing pressure to respond as the effects of a company's departure spread from workers to communities and into commercial real estate. Attention inevitably turns to state leadership. At this stage, silence becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Business exits may begin as private corporate decisions, but once their consequences become visible, they transform into public accountability issues. Pressure builds from multiple directions at once. Workers want clarity about job protections and economic support. Local governments seek reassurance about revenue stability and redevelopment plans. Business leaders look for signals about whether the conditions that prompted the exit are likely to change. Each group expects a response, even if solutions are not immediately available. For the governor, this moment represents a narrowing window. Delayed responses can be interpreted as indifference or denial, while rushed statements risk oversimplifying complex economic forces. Public messaging becomes a balancing act, acknowledging concern without amplifying fear and defending policy goals without dismissing real consequences. This issue matters because leadership responses shape perception. Markets, investors, and other companies interpret silence as uncertainty. A visible response, even a limited one, signals recognition that the issue extends beyond a single company. It suggests that the state understands the stakes and is at least evaluating the underlying pressures. At this point in the escalation, the crisis is no longer just economic. It becomes political and reputational. The way leadership responds or delays responding sets expectations for what comes next, pushing the situation toward a critical moment where acknowledgement must evolve into explanation and direction. 6. Governor's statement signals recognition, not resolution. When the governor finally responds to a company leaving the state, the message carries weight, not because it immediately solves the problem, but because it marks a shift from silence to acknowledgement. At this stage, the response signals recognition that the exit is not an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern affecting California's economic landscape. Typically, these statements emphasize California's long-term strengths, its talent base, innovation economy, and global influence. The governor may reaffirm commitment to environmental goals, worker protections, or long-standing policy priorities. What is often absent, however, is a clear explanation of how the state intends to reduce the pressures that prompted the departure in the first place. This gap matters. Businesses and workers listen closely not just for reassurance, but for specificity. Vague optimism may calm immediate headlines, but it does little to address concerns about regulatory predictability, operating costs, or future competitiveness. Without concrete signals, uncertainty persists. For workers and local governments, the statement may feel disconnected from on-the-ground realities. Acknowledgement alone does not stabilize jobs or restore lost investment. For other companies watching from the sidelines, the response becomes part of their risk assessment. They ask whether leadership is prepared to adapt or simply defend the status quo. This issue ranks higher because it represents a turning point. Recognition is necessary but insufficient. When acknowledgement is not followed by clarity, confidence continues to erode. At this stage, the conversation shifts from whether leadership will respond to whether that response will translate into meaningful direction, bringing business confidence and policy clarity into sharper focus. 5. Business confidence hinges on policy clarity. After a company leaves the state and the governor responds, attention shifts to what businesses believe will happen next. At this stage, confidence becomes the central issue. Companies do not require certainty, but they do require clarity. When policy direction remains ambiguous, uncertainty itself becomes a cost. Business leaders assess more than current conditions. They evaluate whether regulatory requirements are likely to expand, stabilize, or evolve in predictable ways. When responses from leadership emphasize values without outlining operational adjustments, which companies are left to fill in the gaps. For some, that gap is enough to delay hiring, postpone investment, or reconsider long-term commitments. Confidence erodes quietly. Expansion plans are paused, capital budgets are redirected to maintenance rather than growth. Site selection teams begin exploring alternatives not necessarily to leave immediately, but to preserve options. These decisions rarely make headlines, yet they shape economic outcomes years in advance. This issue matters because confidence determines momentum. California's advantages, talent density, infrastructure, and innovation ecosystems remain powerful, but they are weighed against perceived risk. When businesses cannot forecast costs or regulatory conditions, those advantages lose some of their pull. For workers, declining confidence translates into fewer opportunities over time. Job creation slows, wage growth moderates, and mobility decreases. For local governments, it means delayed development and uncertain tax projections. At this point, the crisis moves beyond reaction and messaging. It becomes about credibility. Whether policy clarity follows acknowledgement will determine whether confidence stabilizes or continues to weaken, setting the stage for broader fiscal and competitive challenges ahead. 4. Tax revenue risks become harder to ignore. As business confidence weakens and investment slows, the financial impact begins to surface in California's tax system. Corporate exits and downsizing do not immediately collapse revenue, but they introduce volatility that becomes increasingly difficult to manage. At this stage, the risk is no longer abstract. It shows up in budget projections and fiscal planning. California relies heavily on a relatively small group of high-income earners and large corporations for a significant share of its tax revenue. When companies leave, reduce payrolls, or report lower profits, taxable income declines across multiple channels. Corporate income taxes fall, payroll tax contributions weaken, sales tax revenue softens as affected workers and communities reduce spending. This matters because the effects compound. Revenue losses tied to a single company may appear manageable, but when multiple exits occur within a short period, the cumulative impact grows quickly. Budget forecasts become less reliable, forcing the state to rely more heavily on reserves or short-term adjustments. For policymakers, this creates difficult trade-offs. Funding for infrastructure, education, housing programs, and environmental initiatives depends on stable revenue streams. When volatility increases, long-term planning becomes harder to sustain. Cuts or delays may be required even as demands for public services rise. At this point, the issue is no longer confined to business or employment. It becomes a governance challenge. Fiscal stress heightens scrutiny of economic policy choices and intensifies pressure on leadership to demonstrate that the state can maintain both its priorities and its financial stability, pushing the crisis toward questions of long-term competitiveness. 3. Exit decisions influence other companies' calculations. When a company leaves the state and receives a public response from leadership, the impact extends beyond that single decision. Other companies, especially those already evaluating their long-term strategies, begin incorporating the exit into their own calculations. At this stage, the departure becomes a reference point rather than an anomaly. Corporate decision-making is heavily influenced by precedent. Executives and boards ask whether the conditions that led one company to leave could apply to them next. Even firms with no immediate plans to relocate start stress testing scenarios. Higher compliance costs, longer permitting timelines, increased regulatory exposure, or future tax uncertainty. These assessments often happen quietly and months or years before any public action. This issue matters because it affects momentum. When exits accumulate, they normalize the idea that leaving California is feasible. The psychological barrier lowers. What was once viewed as a last resort becomes one option among many. Companies may not leave immediately, but they diversify operations, expand elsewhere, or shift new investment out of state. For California, this dynamic is particularly sensitive. The state's economy benefits from network effects, clusters of companies, suppliers, and talent reinforcing one another. When anchor firms depart or scale back, those networks weaken over time. Suppliers lose customers, service firms lose contracts, talent begins to follow opportunity. At this point, the risk is no longer about one company or one response. It is about signal transmission. Each exit sends information into the market. Whether that signal stabilizes or accelerates departures depends on what comes next, bringing the focus squarely onto California's long-term competitiveness and its ability to retain and attract businesses at scale. 2. Long-term competitiveness comes into question. As exits accumulate and confidence weakens, California reaches a point where the discussion shifts from short-term disruption to long-term competitiveness. At this stage, the issue is no longer whether the state can absorb individual company departures, but whether its overall economic model remains attractive in a more mobile, competitive business environment. California's strengths are real and substantial. It offers unmatched talent pools, leading research institutions, deep capital markets, and global brand recognition. However, competitiveness depends on balance. When operating costs, regulatory complexity, and uncertainty grow faster than the advantages they are meant to support, businesses begin to reassess where growth is best placed. Long-term competitiveness is shaped by expectations. Companies plan investments years in advance, factoring in permitting timelines, compliance costs, labor availability, and tax exposure. When these variables become difficult to forecast, even highly innovative firms may hesitate to expand locally. Instead, they build redundancy elsewhere, spreading operations across states or countries with clearer cost structures. This issue matters because competitiveness erodes gradually. There is rarely a single tipping point. Instead, opportunities that might have gone to California quietly land somewhere else. New campuses, research facilities, and manufacturing sites are built outside the state, not as protests, but as risk management. For workers and communities, this translates into fewer future opportunities rather than immediate losses. Job growth slows, wage pressure eases, mobility decreases. Over time, the economic gap between California and faster-growing regions narrows. At this point in the escalation, the governor's response is tested not by words, but by outcomes. Whether competitiveness stabilizes or continues to weaken depends on whether acknowledgement evolves into policy clarity and adaptive reform. One governor's response tests the state's path forward. At the highest level, the governor's response to a company leaving the state becomes a defining test of California's economic direction. By this stage, the issue is no longer about a single departure or a single statement. It is about whether state leadership can translate recognition into a credible path forward that restores confidence without abandoning long-term priorities. Words alone are no longer enough. Businesses, workers, and local governments are watching for signals that policy adjustments are possible, that regulatory frameworks can evolve without losing their core intent. The response is measured not by tone, but by whether it leads to clearer timelines, streamlined processes, or greater predictability for companies operating in the state. This moment matters because it shapes expectations. If leadership demonstrates flexibility and responsiveness, it can slow the momentum of exits and stabilize long-term planning. If the response remains purely rhetorical, uncertainty persists, and companies continue managing risk by expanding elsewhere. The absence of change becomes a signal in itself. For workers, this stage determines whether future opportunities remain concentrated in California or gradually disperse. For communities, it affects redevelopment prospects and economic resilience. For the state, it defines whether California can sustain its role as a global business leader while adapting to a more competitive environment. This ranks as the most severe outcome because it reflects convergence. Economic pressure, public accountability, fiscal risk, and competitiveness all intersect here. The governor's response is not just a reaction, it is a pivot point. What follows will shape California's business climate for years to come. Across this sequence, a clear pattern emerges. A single company leaving the state triggers a chain reaction that moves from workers and communities to real estate, business confidence, tax revenue, and long-term competitiveness. The governor's response marks an important moment of recognition, but recognition alone does not resolve structural pressures. California's challenge is no longer whether it remains an economic powerhouse. It does. The challenge is whether its policies can adapt fast enough to retain businesses while preserving long-term priorities. What happens next will determine whether recent exits remain isolated decisions or become the foundation of a broader shift in how companies engage with the state.